Hey, everybody, it's Bruce McIntyre, CEO of the Oklahoma Parkinson's Alliance again, and we're glad to have you with us. Once want to remind you, we do things all over the state. Well, we coordinate over 30 support groups, about 25 currently, loud crowds to help with voice and swallowing, almost 30 exercise groups that we either pay for, subsidize, or just promote and help get started. Along with, you can do free family consultations with us. We'll talk A to Z about everything you know and don't know about Parkinson's and what your next right moves are. We have education conferences. You can go to oklahomapa.org to see what's coming up next. And I want to remind you, we've made a rebrand, done a rebrand and a rename that we rolled out this summer from Parkinson Foundation of Oklahoma to Oklahoma Parkinson's Alliance. Same people, same organization, same mission, new name. So just be looking for that new logo. That's us, all the same folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Lawton, and across the state. So today we're in the third part of a three-part caregiving series with one of the country's foremost experts on family caregiving, Denise Brown. I've known Denise for a long time. She brings a lot of heart and a lot of expertise to the topic. So Denise, take it away.
Thank you so much, Bruce. And as always, it's great to be with you. And it's so nice to connect with all of you. Thank you so much for watching. We're concluding our three-part series with a conversation about enough, because I think the question of, am I doing enough, is what wakes us up at night and often derails our day. We just worry so much about whether or not we're showing up enough for our caree, for other family members, if we're still in the workplace, for our colleagues, and then it feels like for ourselves, but that's lowest on our list. And this idea about enough is so hard for us to figure out because we're caring for someone with really complex, almost constant care needs. And we're monitoring a disease process that has its own mind. So it's not necessarily always easy to predict what could happen next. We know, because Bruce, you've done such a great job educating everybody about what could happen next in the progression of a disease, but every disease progression is different and every individual is different within their disease progression. In addition, our resources are different from one family caregiver to another. So what we can pull on in terms of resources could be different. And the other piece of it too is our availability of resources could be different from day to day, from minute to minute, from morning to afternoon. So we're always trying to figure out what's enough. And I think it's something that we feel like we're chasing, that we're looking for someone else to tell us, okay, that's enough. You've done enough. And what we want to do today is give you this idea that you are doing enough. You are enough. And that whatever enough is for you today is enough. Because our definition of enough can change and we can actually define it. So I've got a tool that we can look at that can help us figure out what we can do in terms of enough. And I wonder if you don't mind making me a co-host, Bruce. I think about something during caregiving that's so important, and that is our peace of mind. And when we have a definition of enough, I think that's when we find our peace of mind, because we want to be able to sleep well at night. And we want to be able to say, when caregiving ends, we did enough. So let's think about how we can define enough for ourselves and actually for our caree and for our day and for other family members. And we can use this tool to help us figure that out. So for instance, we can think about what's enough sleep. Now we know that it's recommended we get 7 to 8 hours. And that will be our goal, but there might be some nights where we just couldn't sleep because the disease got us up. And then we think, okay, I didn't get enough sleep last night. So what's enough for the day after a bad night's sleep? And then we can adjust what we do based on what our energy level is. So this idea that if we don't sleep well, we're going to adjust our next day. We're not just going to power through because we know we might not have enough energy. And that's okay. So there could be some things that typically we do, we don't even give them a second thought. But on the day after a bad night's sleep, we think, okay, that can wait. Now you might think, okay, but every night is a bad night's sleep. And that's the challenge. How do you figure it out when you're always struggling to get enough sleep? So maybe it's thinking, okay, I didn't get a good night's sleep. So I'm going to look at what's my cat nap in the morning and in the afternoon. When can I close my eyes to just rest and relax? And then thinking about what's enough as it relates to a little bit of a nap, but knowing that you deserve that little bit of time to rest and close your eyes. And then thinking about what's enough support for you? What's enough support for your caree? And what's the support around a disease process? And I often think we worry about fun because we want to still enjoy life, and it can feel sometimes like it's hard to do. But we can also think about what's enough fun for this week, for this moment, for this holiday season, knowing that, again, our ability to have fun is going to ebb and flow, and that's okay. And that when we have enough, when we have a moment that feels like, well, we're really having fun, it's important to stay focused on that moment and receive it, because that memory of having fun is going to remind you that you were enough. That's important. And then thinking about what's enough in the bank. And that's something that sometimes we feel like, well, there's never enough, but maybe we can think about it as it relates to enough in the bank for today, enough in the bank for tomorrow. I also think we live in our climate is in such crisis that I also think when we're looking at what the bank holds, we want to make sure we have enough for a crisis as it relates to weather. So for instance, we might think, you know what? This fall and this winter, I'm going to start saving because I don't know what our tornado season is going to be like in the spring and summer. So I'm going to set aside $10 every week just so I have this emergency fund just in case there's some kind of climate crisis in our area. So I feel like, okay, I have enough to manage. And then thinking about what's enough in terms of how many breaks do I take? How many times during the day do I give myself 5 minutes, 1 minute? How many times during the week do I give myself an hour? And then work, what's enough as it relates to work? And then what's enough as it relates to caregiving today, this week, this month, this year? Okay, Bruce, what do you think?
Well, I think you've covered a lot of relevant areas that we're all thinking about. For Parkinson's specifically, good night's sleep is pretty elusive. And a lot of times there comes a point, even um, in the trajectory of the disease process, because folks can live with Parkinson's for 20 or 30 years, is not uncommon at all. And especially as it goes along, tend to have really, the patient tends to have pretty fitful sleep, which of course is not only their problem, but if there's someone on the other side of the bed, that is problematic. And so, often a tough decision though, caregivers and patients sometimes have to decide it's time to be in separate beds. That's okay. If everyone can get a better night's sleep that way, that's a better outcome. It's not what you want to do necessarily, but maybe a thing to do. So there are all kinds of pursuits when it comes to sleep, and I think you covered all of these really well. Um, I like the idea that you mentioned on fun. Sometimes we become so burdened and so obsessed that all we see is the day-to-day struggle. And even if it's short moments of fun, it is important to allow yourself the laughter. You have permission.
You made an interesting point about sleep, and it's around where we could sleep. And I know that that's tough when it feels like there's a break in terms of the sleep, where people sleep, and that feels like a break in intimacy, even if the intimacy is just that you share a bed. And it's important to think about there's other ways to have intimacy during the day. So if how you sleep and where you sleep interrupts that intimacy, think about, okay, that's a change for us. What's the solution for it? There's intimacy that's important for us in our relationship. So how do we recreate that in different ways during the day? And the truth is, when you both have a better night's sleep, then it's easier to think about what's the opportunity for us to sit together and hold hands? What's the opportunity for us to share a hug? Let's keep the intimacy. Let's just think about how it looks and how it feels and when it happens. So it doesn't have to just always just happen at in one particular room, so to speak. It can happen throughout our day by holding hands, sharing a hug, sharing words of love as well, because that's an important part of intimacy.
Yeah, I think you really bring up an important aspect of sleep, and we often do think of that along with intimacy. And I don't know how many times, just in the course of meeting Parkinson's patients and families across the state of Oklahoma, that I've run across people, and I'm not a big hugger, really. I'm more of a high fiver, but but I do hug people, and sometimes when I've had people say, especially a caregiver, will say, "Oh, you don't know how much I needed that." And as we go through, even without Parkinson's, maybe if you think in the context of a marriage, you go through decades maybe together, and sometimes that intimacy falls off. And so, my wife, we've been married 27 years, and like I said, I'm not a hugger. Touch is one of her love languages. It's not one of mine, and she will just tell me. She'll say, I need a hug. and so she'll just ask. I'm like, oh, okay, okay. But we've talked about that. And so it might even be a good opportunity for conversation to level the playing field, make it not weird, give permission to say, can we hold hands? Can we hug? If that's what the patient or the caregiver needs, and if sleep patterns or locations have changed, that's a totally fair conversation to have.
And I think it's also important for us to acknowledge that there's grief around a change in a sleeping arrangement and to give ourselves enough time to process through that and enough grace to acknowledge that that is a loss that hurts. So, as Kathy tells you, what's enough in terms of hugs and touches, I think it's important for us to check in and say, what's enough for me as it relates to time and space to process a change? And then how do I tell people in my life that I'm processing a change and need time and space in order for that to happen? Because for others in the family, for instance, it might seem like a no-brainer to have a change in sleeping arrangements, but it's not a no-brainer for you. And it's important to tell people that so they understand your perspective and why it might seem like a really emotional day when you set up a bedroom outside of your typical bedroom. The other thing that I think is important for us to remember about enough is that we get to decide enough as it relates to when our day begins and when our day ends. And I think of it as our store hours. So in our caregiving experience, we can have store hours. We can have store hours as it relates to when do we take phone calls at the beginning of the day and when's the last time we take phone calls. So for instance, maybe we say to everyone, I answer the phone after 7 and then before 8. And if you call me after 8, I let it go to voicemail. And that could be a way for you to protect those sleeping hours. So you're not sleeping, but at least you're relaxing, you're resting, you're no longer on call. It can be the same around meals. It could be the same around text messages, anything that you feel like people are asking something of you, and it's typically your time and energy. You can think about what's enough for you. And it also could be when people ask you to help out in certain situations and you think, oh, I'd love to, but right now there's enough going on for me in caregiving that I just can't. I just can't. And it's okay to say no, thank you, and leave it at that. That's enough. The other thing I think about enough too is sometimes we go on really long explanations around why something is enough for us, and we can simply say, that's enough. So we don't have to have an expansive explanation, and we don't have to apologize. There's a simple phrase, never explain, never complain. And I learned that from Phil Donahue, who was a TV host in Chicago, where I am from and where I grew up. And that was one of his family rules. And I learned that probably 40 years ago, and I remember it to this day. Never explain, never complain. And this idea that you don't have to explain your definition of enough to another, just has to make sense to you. There's one other wheel I want to show you, and that relates to limits too. And I also want to mention too that it takes courage to know what's enough. So you might actually think of a definition today around enough as it relates to a category of your life, and you feel like, okay, that's good. And then as you live with it, you think, oh God, I didn't quite get that right. That's okay. Give yourself the courage to redefine it and tell people, oh, you know what? I thought I could take phone calls until 9, but I can't. I need to rest, relax. The days are long for me. Please don't call me after 8. And then within our caregiving experience, we also experience limits. And so we can think about, what are my limits? Because that will also help you define what's enough. I'm curious, Bruce, as you look at this wheel, what's a word that stands out to you that you hadn't thought of as it relates to limits?
Well, as far as what I hadn't thought about, I resources, the limits of resources. The one that I do respond to more immediately is time and space. I tend to be pretty good with being a boundary setter. When I'm on, and when I'm off, I'm off. I mean, as you were talking earlier about the phone, I definitely utilize the do not disturb function on my phone. And when I'm no more calls, it's no more calls, unless it's these specific people they can get through. But resources, I don't know. What do you mean by that?
Okay, there could be a limit in terms of the resources that are available to us. And so then we have to acknowledge, I wish I had this resource. It's just not available for me right now. So the resources that are available for me are this. I also think we have a limit in terms of our resource. So we're this amazing resource for our caree, for other family members, for other family caregivers. And we might think of, what's the limit of my resources? And to know that it's okay to have a limit. I just can't make dinner tonight. My resources are done. I can't think of anything to cook. I can't find anything to cook. I'm done. And I also think if we think about resources as supplies, products, organizations that help us, and individuals that help us, as well as technology. You gave a great example about how you use technology. Do not disturb. That's a resource that's available for you to use. So look to resources in a broader sense than you typically think about. Okay, it's the home health aide that comes. It's the organization that I look to. So the word that always jumps out to me when I look at this is stomach. So I think about it as it relates to today, what could I stomach? And it could be related to wound care or a disease process or a family conversation. So for instance, with my mom, when we were really going to conversations about her end of life, which included that she wanted to be cremated, and then we had the cremation society come to fill out the paperwork with her, she could barely stomach it. And she got through it. She signed her name. And then she said to me, my stomach is upset. I can't be here anymore. So we were like, go lay down, take a break. And then we finished up with my father on his own. So know what you can stomach. And sometimes there's just a reality of our caregiving experience that feels like it's right there in our stomach. It's a punch in the gut. And it's okay to listen to it and think, okay, it's too much for me right now. My stomach is telling me I need to take a break. I want to be in reality. I'm not going into denial. I just am giving myself a chance to adjust because my stomach is telling me I need a little break.
Yeah, I think, of course, about the disease, and in Parkinson's disease, we tell people all the time, do what you can do as long as you can do it. And that's generally a really good principle because it keeps you going physically, cognitively, socially, all different ways. But there also comes a point when you need to stop doing some things because of the disease. It's just not a good idea anymore. Chief among those, and perhaps most difficult, is the day that someone says, I think it's time for me to stop driving. That's a tough one. I rarely see people do that easily. But there does come a point when that's a limit to draw, or things like that. And that's a grief unto itself. It's a transition unto itself. That's a very difficult one. But yeah, Parkinson's, unfortunately, as time goes on, it imposes some limits.
Yeah, that's what's so hard too, because they're limits that we don't want. And there are limits on a caree and there's limits on the family caregiver because of that disease process. And it's something we didn't ask for. It's something that feels unfair. And yet we are called to just accept this. And sometimes our heart is telling us that I need a break from acceptance because what I'm asked to accept just feels unacceptable in this moment, for this morning, for this day. And that when you feel the heartbreak too, know that it's okay to just give yourself a chance to heal the heart. We had talked a little bit about this when we were talking about recovery, that oftentimes we feel like we have to power through. And the other thing about this limits wheel is that it helps us remind ourselves that we do have limits about what we can sustain. And it's good to know that we need to take a break so that we can be enough without actually taking a little time for ourselves. It's hard to be enough for ourselves as well, including for our caree and other family members. Okay, so that's enough. So think about it as a definition you can create around categories in your life. And because it's your definition, you get to change it. You can decide what's enough today, what's enough for a particular day of the week, and what's enough around a particular time during your day, and what's enough for you on difficult days where the news seems really heartbreaking. Know that you can be gentle with yourself and give yourself enough so that you can keep going.
Denise, thank you so much for sharing your heart and your expertise with us. This has been really a great series, and we're so glad that that you've been able to be with us virtually from Chicago. And I know that you'll learn so much. I encourage everyone to share these sessions with people who may not know about them, and hopefully it brings some encouragement and insight to them. So for the Oklahoma Parkinson's Alliance, know this: we're here to inspire hope and transform life for Parkinson patients and families in Oklahoma. And we're so glad that you've joined us on this series. And we're here to help you do the very best that you can, whether you're the patient, family member. We're so glad that you've joined us. So thank you. And we will see you along the way.